Welcome everybody to our monthly hazardous webinar series, From Devastation, Hard Lessons Are Learned. In this special December hazardous webinar, we're marking the respective 50-year and 20-year anniversaries of 1974's Cyclone Tracy and the 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami, and their continuing legacy in driving Australia's preparation, response, recovery and resilience to catastrophic disasters. I'll introduce the panel shortly. My name is Cheryl Desha and I am the Science and Innovation Director at Natural Hazards Research Australia, or NHRA. I acknowledge that today we meet on a range of different Aboriginal lands. I'm coming to you from Meanjin, Brisbane, Turrbal and Yagara country. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of all the lands we live, work and learn on. And I recognise that these lands and waters have always been places of teaching, research and learning. At the end of the panel presentations, we will have a Q&A session. So please make sure that you also add your questions to the Q&A panel and make sure that you specify who your question is for, and we'll get to them as best we can in the last 15 minutes of today's session. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's panel. We have three fantastic contributions. Doug Smith is Natural Hazards Research Australia's board member and grew up in Darwin. And while he had moved away after completing school, he was posted to Cyclone Tracy's recovery as a Victorian police officer. Doug's career in public safety, policing and national security has seen him involved in diverse leadership roles, including many major events and responses to natural hazards. As a brief snapshot, Doug, because there's so much to share about you potentially, you have served as the Deputy Commissioner in Queensland Police Service, Deputy Commissioner at the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, Chief Executive Officer at the CrimTac Agency and Assistant Commissioner in the Northern Territory Police, Fire and Emergency Services. Today, Doug will set the scene for the webinar with some reflections from his experience in the immediate aftermath of Tracy as a first responder and its enduring mark on his life and career. After Doug speaks, we'll hear from Adjunct Professor George Walker, and this should be a name familiar to many of you in the disaster and engineering world, as the lead in the investigation of damage caused to buildings by Tracy for the federal government. George was one of the founders of James Cook University's Cyclone Testing Station, and the work after Tracy catalysed building code changes that continue to improve infrastructure resilience today as a long tail of enduring impacts from that decision-making at the time. After leaving academia, George had several roles, senior roles in CSIRO and reinsurance. Today, George is going to share the engineering impacts and building code changes that were brought about by Cyclone Tracy and how the disaster and recovery shifted the way disaster research is carried out in Australia and the ongoing global impact of Cyclone Tracy in reinsurance. We're thrilled to have a video presentation from George to play before he joins us live for the panel Q&A. Our last speaker today and fantastic contribution to the webinar is Dr. Jane Sexton, who is the Executive Manager Hazard and Risk for the Queensland Fire Department. Jane currently leads a tsunami risk modelling project in Queensland through the Coastal and Estuarine Mitigation Program, and has been a member of the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group and its predecessors since 2005. Feels like just yesterday, Jane, but indeed it has been a while. Jane has led tsunami modelling projects around Australia under the auspices of the Australian Tsunami Warning System Program and has extensive experience in a variety of roles at the Defence Science and Technology Organisation and Geoscience Australia. Jane's also been an important end user of research with our Natural Hazards Research Australia and our predecessor, the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. So that gives you a snapshot of our fabulous speakers for today. And we are so honoured to have their time with us, learning about some insights and experiences that really can carry us forward with renewed enthusiasm and I think a sense of purpose as we face the challenges ahead of us. After disasters, it is important to reflect, and both Tracy and the tsunami have had profound impacts on disaster resilience. So let's get going with the presentations, and before then we dive into the Q&A session with the panel. Doug, I welcome you to activate your video and your audio and take us away on your journey.
Thanks very much, Cheryl, and thanks for that introduction, and good morning to everybody. A very brief background. I grew up in Alice Springs, the Northern Territory, in the 1960s. I went to Darwin High School. Upon completing high school, I had a great ambition to join the police, but in the Northern Territory, you had to be 21 to become a police officer. So I made the decision to be a police cadet and a police officer in Victoria until I got to the age of 21. While I was in the Victoria Police, I'd still return to Darwin for holidays and very much maintain my contacts with the people of Darwin and friends and family there. I was working in a Paran police station on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Absolutely no information had come into our systems, if you like, that there was any threat from any storm to Darwin. In fact, on Christmas Day, I was approached by the duty inspector in the Victoria Police who was responsible for Paran, and I was told, you're from Darwin, you know your way around the place, you'll be going to Darwin because of the cyclone, go and pack. Completely unaware of the situation that was unfolding because there was nothing on the news by Christmas morning that day. So I packed, made my way to Russell Street headquarters, out to Essendon Airport. We got on a C-130 Hercules aircraft, which took us to Adelaide. In Adelaide, it was loaded up with fridges, water purifiers, generators. So we shared a flight on the C-130 back to Richmond. I'm not sure why we went to Richmond Air Force Base near Newcastle. We then flew to Mount Isa. And as we flew from Mount Isa to Darwin, we got into some very heavy weather. So by the time we got to Darwin, after a pretty long and uncomfortable flight, as we flew into Darwin, there was very, very little that you could see out of the aircraft to indicate that there'd been a cyclone. And I've been through cyclones before, not of that magnitude. But as we flew closer to Darwin, the damage that was done to the area around Darwin by the storm became very apparent. And why that's important is that it was a very, very small impact area for a cyclone. It was about 60 kilometres across. So if you lived in Geelong and the cyclone had hit Geelong, that cyclone would not have been felt. The winds would not have been felt in Melbourne. It was that intense. Upon landing in Darwin, we were met by a Northern Territory police officer, taken into a building where we were to be accommodated. It was a government office block with absolutely no facilities for people to be living there, but it was all that was available. We were then tasked to do a number of jobs. Now, the primary task, the original task, was to go house to house, and you're looking at some of the pictures of the houses there. We went through every house, our tasks together with other police, to go to every house, search every part of the houses, to see if there were any survivors, any bodies that hadn't been located. Now, there was no power, no running water, and very, very little communication available to us at the time. So it was very much a paper exercise, writing things down, making sure that every house had been searched. Any of the people that were injured obviously were taken to the RAF base for taking out of Darwin. And then the deceased were taken primarily to the Casuarina post office, where they'd been able to put a generator on to provide some cooling. Now, at the time, just to understand the scenario, we're not dealing with a situation where there was communication available to give people information. So what was occurring was people were going to places that were still standing, and these were primarily the Casuarina shopping centre, Casuarina post office, Casuarina police station, or schools, which were all structurally so sound that people could actually use those facilities. The communication problem became very, very difficult after about 2 days. And it was really important to get information out to people because no one really knew what was occurring at the time. One of the things that we would do every day would take a piece of paper with the information to be provided to groups of people if we came across them, to let them know what was occurring with respect to evacuations, what was occurring with respect to injured people, and what was occurring with respect to the deceased. The task after going from house to house to make sure that everyone had been accounted for, whether they were living, injured or dead, was then to help with the evacuation. Now, Darwin at the time had a population of just over 40,000, and the lead from the Commonwealth, Major General Sexton, had quite sensibly decided that with no water, no power, and being so remote from the rest of the country, that the primary task at that point in time was to get people out of the city. So the mission was to evacuate 30 to 35,000 people as quickly as possible. Now, about 10,000 people self-evacuated by driving out of Darwin, and the other 30,000, the other 20 to 25,000 were evacuated by air. Now, the evacuation by air had its significant challenges, and I'd just like to talk about that a little bit in a second. This was our house in Darwin that I went back to, and after a few days, we started to colloquially call those the Darwin dance floors, because that was all that they really after the damage had been cleaned up. Now, with respect to the communication challenges, the ability to communicate and give some authority to the communication became very important. Darwin had only recently got television. It had a radio station. Its connection with the outside world was based on microwave towers that were spread across the country. And getting a document that people could read became critically important. Now, this is a copy of the Northern Territory News on the 26th of December 1974. And what this enabled us to do was to put this in all of the standing buildings that people were congregating to, so they could look at that and get some idea, if you like, of the official language which was occurring with respect to help, evacuation, etc. After a couple of days, it was critically important with respect to health. Now, there's no sewage, there's no running water, it's incredibly hot and humid, and food was very, very short supply. So the ability for people to eat, to keep hydrated, the basics was very, very much a challenge. Now, you'll notice, if you look closely at that, that one of the reporters on that particular Northern Territory News was Alan Kohler, who's still on the ABC today. What had occurred was that we'd gone to an office supply shop in Kavanagh Street in Darwin. We're able to locate a printer. That was taken to the Darwin Police Station in Mitchell Street, and we were able to produce a number of copies. I think it was about 25 copies were produced of this edition of the Northern Territory News to be posted around the city. This had a remarkable effect on people because it wasn't word of mouth. It gave them some sort of official context with what was happening. The next thing I'll just mention is about the evacuation itself. Now, having 20,000 plus people to be flown out in a few days out of a city across the country came with real challenges. Some friends of mine, I've highlighted on this particular slide, part of the list of all the people evacuated from Darwin. Now, this was prepared from telex messages. After a couple of days, we had the ability to send telex messages to Canberra, and these were all collated by the ACT Police, which was one of the forerunners. We didn't have an Australian Federal Police like we have now. So the ACT Police were the coordinator, together with the Red Cross, of the list of all evacuees. You'll see that that document's dated the 10th of January 1975. Now, this part that I've highlighted is the Cashman family, who anyone who knows Darwin, Cashmans were quite one of the old families in Darwin. They had the news agency and a number of other retail shops. So you'll see here that according to this particular document, Beryl Cashman, who'd been born in 1907, was evacuated to Sydney and Brisbane, and her family had been evacuated to Melbourne. That was her son, daughter-in-law, and their kids. In fact, Mrs. Cashman turned up in Brisbane eventually, but it just shows the challenge of trying to keep people informed of where they had gone. We had no ability to do that. And if I could just have the next slide with respect to the evacuation. So again, this is an example of how confusing it was. You can see here that Erica Chin, also a friend of mine from school, she'd been evacuated to Darwin, Sydney, and Perth. So when people started to collate the information, it was from the information that was coming out of Darwin, and the information coming out of Darwin wasn't very good. For some people, it took weeks before they were able to be reconnected with family members. And in some instances, children had been evacuated very early, not in company with parents, to other cities where their parents were not evacuated to, and it caused a lot of distress in the weeks afterwards. On Boxing Day, it became really important to evacuate people out of the Darwin Hospital. Now, the Darwin Hospital was in the Larrakia area of Darwin at the time, been absolutely destroyed. And a very quick example here is the words of the pilot of that Fokker F-27 Friendship. He'd gone to Darwin in that aircraft. He'd been given a plane load of pregnant women from the from the Darwin Hospital. He had 40 women in last stage pregnancy. When he got to Mount Isa, there was no indication of where he should take them. And so on his own initiative, he eventually got those people to Mackay Hospital, but they had no information with respect to partners. So that's just a reflection on some of the big issues. It was communication. It was trying to regain order with respect to health, with respect to water, sewage, etc., and to make sure then that we could manage the evacuation of 20-odd thousand people that had flown out and the 10,000 that drove out. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Doug. There's such important artifacts and stories from Cyclone Tracy. Really appreciate the sharing and the time that you've taken to pull those materials together for today. We'll move on to George's presentation now. Noting on your devices, depending on your internet connection, you might notice slight lag in the video. Have patience with it and feel free to turn up the volume on your device for this part of the sharing of the webinar if it's a little bit quiet. Let's commence. Thank you.
As you heard, I led the investigation of Cyclone Tracy damage, which resulted in a 3-volume report of the damage, the causes and recommendations for what should be done. These recommendations have effectively underpinned every building, the design in Australia, certainly in the cyclone areas, but largely in Australia as well, since then. My involvement in this dominated the remainder of my working life. First 15 years at James Cook University, I was involved in wind engineering in terms of the implementation of the recommendations of the report, and also in interdisciplinary disaster studies that we undertook as well. The next 26 years I was at CSIRO and the reinsurance subsidiary of Aon, where I had a lot to do with building regulations, catastrophe insurance and emergency management. And in the 9 years since retirement, my main interest has been community disaster resilience. The damage in Cyclone Tracy was primarily to housing. It was the direct cause of the disaster. Only about 10% remained habitable, while about 80% or more of engineered buildings remained habitable. The major recommendation arising from the report was therefore that houses should be structurally engineered for wind, something that didn't happen in those days because they were built according to traditional practice, which was largely based on experience. These were initially adopted for the reconstruction of Darwin and then for cyclone areas, and subsequently, since about 2000, they've been adopted nationwide in the National Construction Code. Some special requirements were found needed for cyclone regions. Most houses, most buildings, in fact, are only designed for what we call ordinary pressures. But we found in Cyclone Tracy, because of all the window failures, houses get pressurised. We call them internal pressures. We find this every time there's a major cyclone. And a requirement now is that you design for these in cyclone areas. We also found that the metal roof fastening systems were very subject to fatigue, largely because of a change to using high-strength steel, which was very brittle under the long duration of fluctuating loads created by cyclones. It was also realised that the method of estimating extreme winds in cyclone areas was very unreliable, depending as it did on statistical analysis of extreme wind speeds recorded in each area. And of course, that meant very sparse information as far as cyclones were concerned. So there was a change to using GIS-based modelling of tropical cyclones and their impact in terms of wind speeds, using computers and using accumulated information on all the cyclones for which there was records, of which it was a much bigger base than just maximum wind speeds recorded. These are the basis on which design wind speeds have been based ever since Cyclone Tracy in cyclone areas. It also resulted in a big investment in wind engineering research, one of the beneficiaries being the Cyclone Testing Station at James Cook University, which was established in 1977. The magnitude of the Cyclone Tracy disaster was due to an interaction between the natural environment, with meteorology and geography, the built environment in terms of building and the infrastructure, the human environment, individuals and organisations, and the economic environment like insurance, charities, government, personal wealth. It was soon recognised that disaster reduction studies required a multidisciplinary approach, and that led to the establishment of the Centre for Disaster Studies, James Cook University, in the late 1970s. At the time, the first such centre in Australia and one of only 3 or 4 in the world at that time. It mainly focused on disaster investigation, education and research. The Natural Hazards Research Australia unit is the latest iteration in this, in what's happened since in this field in Australia. Cyclone Tracy had a big impact on the insurance industry because, like houses, the insurance risk was based on past experience, and there'd been no experience of such an event like Cyclone Tracy. Many companies in Australia probably only survived intact because many houses were not insured because they were owned by the government. As a result, the industry recognised that basing catastrophe reinsurance cover on past experience only was inadequate for coping with extreme events. This led to the development by the Insurance Council of Australia of a method called Catastrophe Zone PML method of analysis, PML being the probable maximum loss in a zone, and it equaled the sum insured by a company in the zone times the agreed zone percentage loss. They looked at all these throughout Australia, and whichever came up biggest, that decided how much reinsurance they would buy. This method was so effective that subsequently it was taken up globally, where it's known as the crest zone method. In the 1990s, it was superseded by GIS simulation of catastrophe loss risk, which was essentially an extension of the type of GIS wind speed risk simulation that we'd already was already being used in Australia for design wind speeds. They're now a tool that's daily used in the insurance industry. Emergency management also had a big impact. The Natural Disasters Organisation, which later became EMA, had only recently established at the time of Tracy, and with Major General Sexton in charge. The initial response owed much to this and firmly established the importance of such an agency, and subsequent development of integrated Commonwealth, state and local government approach to emergency management, including state emergency services, owes much to the impetus of Cyclone Tracy. Of course, it continues to evolve with every new disaster, but the basic framework developed in the wake of Cyclone Tracy has largely remained intact. The magnitude of Cyclone Tracy disaster was due to the impact on people of the loss of community functionality and the time and costs of the recovery. It was not due to the number of deaths and injuries, which were actually relatively light for a disaster of its magnitude. Today we would describe this in terms of community disaster resilience. The focus of the authorities after the event was improving the disaster resilience of the Darwin community to ensure such a disaster did not happen again. And Gough Whitlam, as Prime Minister, made that a promise. If we look at Darwin's performance in terms of resilience, we find that within 3 years, community functionality was effectively fully restored, and the community was in a much better shape to face a repeat of Tracy. Consequently, for a disaster of that size, we would regard that as an excellent performance overall of community disaster resilience. Therefore, you might say, disaster resilience is not an issue for Australian communities. Well, no. The reason for this was largely due to the unique character of Darwin at that time, being a Commonwealth town, and also the impact on the individuals was unacceptable, even though within 3 years things were back to roughly normal. Consequently, also subsequent experience of major disasters in other parts of Australia from different types of events has revealed similar shortcomings in community disaster resilience. This leads one to the view that we really should be designing for community disaster resilience. Now, an important part of communities in relation to this is the built environment. And today the National Construction Code has no mention of this as an object. It still says the main objective is reduction of fatalities, which was not a major problem really in Cyclone Tracy. For the most vulnerable communities around Australia, we need to take into account the potential increases of concentration of wealth and population, which will continue to have a major impact on increases in size and magnitude of disasters. We need to take into the different community characteristics, much different in many ways from Darwin, particularly bearing in mind that building regulations only address new buildings. So anything built prior to the advent of current building regulations are still vulnerable in many ways to disasters. Different types of events need to be considered. We need to be aware of the potential effects of climate change on weather effects, which, if some predictions are realised, will make, for some types of events, things worse. And also, we must never forget that in Darwin, the real problem was the impact at the time on individuals. If we are to design for community disaster resilience, we need to take an approach which the first thing we need to be able to do is have a quantitative definition of key parameters, not just a qualitative definition, because design by engineers of buildings depends on having numeracy. We need to be able to define what we mean by magnitude and types of events. How do we measure the impact on individuals and community functionality? How do we actually measure community disaster resilience? Once we've done that, then we'd have to establish acceptable minimum levels of community disaster impact and resilience for different levels of event magnitude up to the maximum credible event, not just the 100-year event or the 500-year event, because most major disasters are much closer to the maximum credible event. One way we need tools to do that, and an important tool, I believe, would be GIS modelling of community disaster resilience as a function of the type and magnitude of event, which would be basically an extension of the GIS catastrophe insurance risk models now used on a daily basis by the insurance industry. It's a challenge for the current and next generation of disaster reduction researchers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Such important insights into how decisions are made after disasters and how they can create really long legacies and improvements to building codes and requirements for planning. As cyclones move southwards along Queensland and northern New South Wales coastlines, we can perhaps prepare with more confidence accordingly for our physical infrastructure and, as you say, George, for our community disaster resilience, indeed. We're going to move on to Jane's presentation now, reflecting on the 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami and the legacies for decision support. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks very much, Cheryl, and hello, everyone. So for a bit of a change in hazard now, it has been 20 years since the Indian Ocean Tsunami in 2004 and the devastating consequences that were felt around the world. This event spurred the Australian government to take action, and in my presentation today, I'll briefly cover those efforts since this devastating event and the ongoing program of works to maintain this momentum so we are prepared for a future tsunami. So my presentation today is based around a short article that appeared in the October edition of the Australian Journal of Emergency Management. So I'd like to give a quick shout out to my co-authors, Matt Zanini from Western Australian Department of Fire and Emergency Services and Yulong Mao from the Bureau of Meteorology. Also at this point, I'd like to acknowledge the image on the screen by one of the sort of leading tsunami scientists at the time of the event, and that was Vasily Titov, who was working for NOAA at the time. So what I'd like to draw attention to in this particular image is that, sure, it's a model, but it gives an indication about the wave height of this tsunami that was felt all around the world. And these are the little circles that are on the screen. And what's important to note is that this event was felt and observed around the Australian coastline. And you can see that there are some observations around Tasmania, New South Wales, and indeed even in Queensland. And there are plenty of accounts of more direct impacts in Western Australia, including Geraldton, where there was some boat damage. But first, I'd like to do a quick reflection on the events that have impacted Australia over the last 20 years. So there's been about 25 in total, so more than one a year. And what I'm going to do is show a quick selection here of some key ones I'd like to draw on. So the 2006 event, which was a magnitude 7.7, so much smaller than the 2004 event, it resulted in the largest run-up that's ever been recorded that we know of in Australia at Steep Point in Western Australia. Some may know the story, but there was some campers there who were actually swept quite some distance. Mum was hanging on to Bub on the front of a four-wheel drive, and it moved some meters inland. It was a very isolated particular sort of point, and no other locations received any particular run-up. So run-up is when the tsunami makes its way onto land and runs up the coast. So there was no warning at this time because the Australian Tsunami Warning System had not yet been operational. But if this event even was to happen today, there's going to be plenty of places around the Australian coastline that a warning won't be able to be received, and particularly there with limited reception. So the next event, yes, is the 2007 magnitude 8.1 from Solomon Islands. The reason why I'm drawing on this one is that it resulted in quite a strong reaction in Cairns at the time. And when you think about it, it was only a few short years after that devastating event, and a tsunami warning was issued for the Queensland coastline. And there was many people who took action and evacuated in Cairns there. The key observation from this event as well that I think is worth acknowledging is that the tsunami did indeed propagate through the Great Barrier Reef. There's a long-held notion by many that the reef offers protection, and indeed there is some, but it's not a wall, and the tsunami can indeed get through a reef. The next event I'd like to talk briefly about is the 2010 Chile event in 2010. So a marine warning was issued for the eastern states and offshore islands of Australia. But what's worth noting is that some may remember or know of the 1960 Chile event, which was the world's largest ever earthquake that was ever recorded. And this event, had large impacts across the Pacific Basin, but also was felt here in Australia, and in particular in Sydney. And you can read more about that in other places. The next event is the volcanic eruption that more of us will be familiar with. So really what I'm trying to highlight here is that tsunami can happen from anywhere. They can have an impact within the Australian environment. We've been fortunate over the last 20 years that we haven't had major impact along our coastline. However, we are doing work so that we are prepared if there ever is a big earthquake to occur. So what happened post 2004? Well, the Australian government committed a significant amount of money to establish the Australian Tsunami Warning System. So this program started in 2005 and included a major expansion of the seismic network and the sea level monitoring network, and the establishment of the Joint Australian Tsunami Warning Centre, which is jointly operated between Geoscience Australia and the Bureau of Meteorology. It also included the development of a national emergency management capability to manage that tsunami risk. And that is implemented through a group, the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group, and I think there are a few members online here today. So ATAG, as it's referred to, consists of every Australian jurisdiction, and as well as offshore territories, and New Zealand are also a member. So key achievements of this group are pulling together some national guidelines that you can see here. These are available through the ADAR website. So emergency planning in Australia, which is currently being updated, some modelling guidelines, and as well as the award-winning Tsunami, the Ultimate Guide, which was really pitched at school-age children to be able to learn more about tsunami. The group also provides knowledge sharing amongst ourselves, but also we draw on a lot of work that is done in our region under the auspices of the UNESCO Tsunami Program. So Australia plays a key role, particularly in the Indian Ocean, and we have been providing, or Australia has been providing, the Secretariat to the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System. And we have learnt a lot from being involved in that program, but we also provide services into the Indian Ocean, and we provide tsunami service to many Indian Ocean countries. So it's important to recognise by being involved in these international programs, so that we can learn from others, and especially others that perhaps have a much higher risk than we do here in Australia. And we are definitely benefiting from that. Through these programs as well, we participate in exercises that are run every other year. So PACWave, for those of you who may not have ever heard about it, as well as IOWave. So these are exercises that are held for all countries in those two basins, and it allows people to exercise across those country boundaries. So since 2004, effort has been invested into tsunami modelling to improve our warning systems and disaster management. So the tsunami alerts that you receive is all underpinned by a database of modelled tsunami scenarios. So once an earthquake's been assessed as having the potential to generate a tsunami, relevant scenarios are selected to inform a warning. And then as more sea level information comes to hand, that scenario selection is refined and the warnings are updated. And the system is designed we have a minimum of 90 minutes of warning time for the Australian coastline. But there's been great advances in hazard modelling for emergency management purposes over the last 20 years. So the really early hazard modelling projects were restricted to a limited number of scenarios, limited extent of the coastline, and they had much coarser resolution elevation data than we have today. So now that we have access to greater high resolution nearshore elevation data that's been collected all around the Australian coastline, these modelling projects can now capture broader extents of the coastline and apply sophisticated sampling of probabilistic scenarios to support local decision making. So over those 20 years, many of our jurisdictions have been fortunate to be able to take advantage of this new approach. Western Australia has done some fantastic work, working with Geoscience Australia to develop the tsunami modelling in Western Australia, and they've been turning that into evacuation mapping that you can see here on the screen. And New South Wales is also adopting the same approach, and the project that I'm running here in Queensland for Gladstone is also taking the same approach. And this is the benefit of the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group, where we can get together and share that knowledge and learn from each other so that we can all be advancing the work. Also, similar projects have also been conducted in Tasmania, where they've involved port authorities, which has been really important for the tsunami risk. But these site-specific projects are only possible because they're all driven by a national definition of tsunami hazard. And so that's the big map in the middle of the screen, which we used to colloquially call the tsunami fence, but that's called the probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment. Now, this has been a step change from the earlier version that was released in 2008. What you're seeing there is a 2018 version, and that was improved post the Tohoku event, where the science community was really challenged by or had made an assumption about what we thought the maximum magnitude earthquake that could occur on the subduction zones around the world. So it was fortunate timing in terms of the update of that assessment, but we're able to take into account new information and science that led to a better definition of that hazard. But that middle box there is what drives and enables all of the other modelling that happens around the country. And so we are taking a consistent approach to understand our tsunami hazard. But you will all understand how big and long the Australian coastline is, and modelling is expensive and it's time consuming, and we need a lot of data in order to run it. So in the absence of having any inundation modelling, what we do is apply a rule of thumb. And that rule of thumb says, let's move 1 kilometre away from the coast and 10 metres high in elevation. And we're going to define that as our baseline for where we would start evacuating people from if there was ever a tsunami warning. However, if we do have more modelling, or if we have modelling that provides us a much more solid evidence base, we can use that instead for our evacuation modelling. And that's what Western Australia, well, all the jurisdictions that have been doing work have been, that's the aim of that work. But here, it's where I want you to imagine the future in another 20 years. So let's imagine it's the 12th of December in 2044. The pressures on the plate boundaries along the Tonga-Kemetic Trench reach their tipping point and release a powerful magnitude 9.4 earthquake. Advanced atmospheric analysis, courtesy of the global satellite system, captures the details of the rupture in near real time. They're going to be transmitted to the 24/7 Operations Centre at the Joint Australian Warning Centre for automatic input into a fast tsunami propagation model implemented on a quantum computer. So within 15 minutes of the rupture, first pass inundation models created of the Australian eastern seaboard and digitally disseminated to all registered users. Meanwhile, you wake up to an alarm on your wearable device that alerts you to a tsunami warning for your location. You don't panic. You know what to do. Just a month ago, during the 2043 World Tsunami Awareness Day, your local community exercised a tsunami evacuation. You know where to go, you know what to take, and you also know who in your neighbourhood that you need to help. So gone are the days of taking your insurance papers. You don't even need a phone charger, but you need to take your medication, change your clothes and your beloved pets and exit. And you knock on your neighbour's door and you leave on foot to the agreed marshalling point beyond the tsunami evacuation zone. There you convene with your neighbours and check on who isn't there and let the emergency services personnel know. So this is the future the emergency management sector is working towards. So we have the components in place, we know the gaps, but we need to maintain momentum. So we've come a really long way in 20 years, really, and there's still a lot more to do. So on this slide here, I've highlighted some key points for understanding the risk, which is the fundamental first step to effectively manage the risk. So the Australian Tsunami Warning System was designed primarily recognising that 75% of a tsunami worldwide are generated by earthquake. But the volcanic eruption in 2022 challenged the systems we have in place. But it's worth remembering that this wasn't the first of its events to ever impact Australia. In 1883, Krakatoa exploded, and this was observed up in northwest WA. And there are no doubt stories held with First Nation groups across the northern Australia. There are a host of volcanic sources in the Oceania region, the obvious ones along the Pacific Rim from Indonesia, PNG, and into the Pacific. But also there's Australia's southwest and also the Heard Island. So we need to know more about what this volcanic source means for us. Here in Australia, we are more fortunate than our neighbours that the subduction zones that are sources of these major earthquakes are not on our doorstep. But we do have other features that hold the potential for tsunami, and that's the continental shelf, where large sediment deposits have the potential to fail and trigger a tsunami. So there's been efforts in the research community to map and characterise these features, and there's still more to do. And a major challenge for a low-frequency hazard like tsunami is the inherent high level of uncertainty. And First Nations knowledge can play an important role to better understand the history. Given the global impact of these major events, knowledge from areas in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean basin are important pieces in the puzzle of understanding the tsunami hazard. But moving into opportunities, there are always advances in technology. We have new sensors, which enables us to better characterise the rupture, to faster tsunami models that we can do in more near real time. Machine learning is also a possibility here, as we are already seeing this in weather forecasting, for example. But the question we are always asking ourselves is the investment, where do we put the small investment that we can make into this hazard? And especially when we don't actually know what the risk is. Can we leverage the coastal adaptation planning programs that are seeking to implement coastal protection measures, for example? I mean, there's plenty of examples internationally showing the mitigating effect on coastal hazards and natural system and the impact of mangroves. And I guess one thing I'd just like to call out before wrapping up is that I think an important point that's worth knowing is that, or thinking about, is that Australians love travelling overseas to locations with a much higher tsunami risk than us. Think Indonesia, Japan, and New Zealand. So how can we better use things like the World Tsunami Awareness Day to raise awareness of this hazard for wherever you are, whether you're at home, work, or travelling? Part of a national community through the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group is working towards the future that I sort of posed to you earlier. But it all fundamentally comes down to knowing our tsunami risk, knowing what to do, and knowing the community around. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Jane, for helping us to appreciate that global story and from the great work that you and others are doing to understand and manage the tsunami hazards and associated risks. It's perhaps not something that we think about every day, as you say. Our exposure compared to other countries is lower. However, the hazard is still there, and that lesson learning is so important. Panelists, can you please come on to the video and audio? I have one question for you to help us wrap up within time, and you each have 2 to 3 minutes each to reflect on this question. Doug, perhaps we'll start with you. We've heard today about the long tail of legacy from decisions made in the aftermath of Cyclone Tracy and the Indian Ocean Tsunami. We've also heard stories of personal experiences and lessons learned. So the question I have for each of you to reflect on, please, is what is your key long-lasting desire? What would you really want people to take away as something that can happen for our communities in Australia to learn from and action in the area of cyclones and tsunamis going forward? So what's your key long-lasting desire for our Australian communities? Doug, you first, and then Jane and George can fight over who goes next.
Thanks, Cheryl. And subject of the time, I'll be very brief. But look, I've been involved in the responses to disasters from Cyclone Tracy. I was actually involved in the response, and I was in the Solomon Islands when the earthquake hit Giza and the tsunami and the subsequent issues there. I think my message to everybody is very, very simple. I mean, we must learn from, we must reflect on, we must study the events, and George's presentation mentioned the consequences of climate change. We've got the ability in this country and work with peers around the world to actually understand what can happen. We need to learn from that. We need to prepare for the events, even if they haven't impacted on us at the moment, and be ready for these things, because the consequences are incredibly significant. It will impact people just like us. It will impact families just like ours, and it will impact communities just like those that we live in. So the really important message is, it's not a headline in the news. It's not a segment on the news on TV. It is actually real. And we know when we look around our country, we've had earthquakes that impacted Newcastle, and we've had the potential impacts of tsunamis in the north of Australia and in the east of Australia. We've had huge impact from fires. So I think what's really important is that we have the ability to actually learn. We need to do that well. And I mean, that's why I continue to be involved through the board at the NHRA, that everyone needs to be aware of it.
George, would you like to go next, or Jane? I think George had. Okay, and then we'll give Jane the final word.
Yeah. Well, the message I'd say is that I still don't think that Australia is focused enough on maximum credible events and their impact on major communities. You've got to remember that Darwin is the last major community, large community, to be directly impacted by a major event. A similar event occurring in southeast Queensland, because it's not regarded as cyclone risk, but it is, could create a huge disaster. So could the maximum credible earthquakes for Sydney and Melbourne and other communities at risk from earthquakes. So I think we've got to of future research has to go, particularly because there continues to be a huge increase in concentration of wealth and population in major centres. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Well said. Cheers. I didn't pay you to say that, but absolutely the passion for curiosity and science and research was very clear through your presentation as well. Really appreciate it. Jane.
Okay. Yeah. Well, look, if I can just maybe have a little joke to start and say, what would be fantastic is if Australians decide not to run to the beach when there's a tsunami warning. That would just be gold. So I think absolutely everything what George said is great, but I think we're challenged with information overload. People have a whole heap of other issues to be dealing with, and when you layer over the top of that, especially when it comes to low frequency hazards and trying to maintain a level of awareness and understanding, that's really difficult. And so I think that's one of the greatest challenges, and really what we need. I think, of course, I'm an advocate for science, coming from a science background, that we need more and more science to get better definition and better clarity on our understanding. However, what we do need is something to be looking at how we can affect behaviour change and an engagement with hazard information and communication, so that we can actually better take care of ourselves and our communities and our families.
Thank you, Jane. Well said. All three, well said. It helps my wrap up most definitely. And I hope that the wrap up of this webinar is actually a conversation starter for our audience today, as you may embark on some more learning, either through Jane's paper that the link has been shared, and or through an exploration of our website. So however you see fit, it's a great opportunity to continue that thinking. So I would just like to say thank you to the panelists to give me the key takeaway, which is the need to remain curious about our past events and what we can learn. I really think that curiosity, Jane, can help drive that meaningful research that then supports behaviour change for our communities, and also for our decision makers who are creating those policies and regulations that George spoke to, and guidelines that will ensure that our houses are safe and that our networks are safe when we're considering those hazards before us. So I would just like to say thank you to our audience. Linking, if you want in future, you're welcome to come back and watch this webinar again. The recording, the presentation materials, and upcoming hazardous webinars all be sent out within the week for you to the links to that for you to check them out. Noting that our first one next year, we kick off on the 28th of January, 1 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. And we're hearing from the New South Wales Department of Climate Change and Energy, the Environment and Water, on operationalising Aboriginal land and sea management. So we're going to be hearing about how the team has trialled ways to facilitate and support our First Nations communities in leading and implementing Indigenous-led land and sea management in New South Wales. So stay tuned for that one. I'm looking forward to that. This year has been an absolute cracker of a year with webinars. We've run 11, including partnering with AFAC and ADA, the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, for our webinars. Thanks to all the presenters throughout the year. We can't run them without you. And that is it for us in 2024. Keep your eyes peeled for the webinar on the 28th of January and for an exciting announcement of the opening of our registrations for the Natural Hazards Research Forum, which is next year. Save the date in your New Year planning, 18th to the 20th of June in the beautiful Adelaide. It's where we were last year. Loved it so much. We're back again and very much looking forward to seeing those early registrations come through. That is it from me. That is it from the panel. Thank you so much and see you next time.